headlines with the journalist and author Rachel Shabi and the Guido Fawkes reporter Tom Harwood. So welcome back, you two.
Thank you.
So let's take a look then at what's making the front pages of the Sundays. And the Mail on Sunday suggests that plans are being drawn up to airlift British citizens out of Wuhan in China, which has been the epicentre of the coronavirus outbreak. The Observer reports that ministers have been told it would cost at least £12 billion to scrap the high-speed rail line HS2. That story is also the lead in the Sunday Telegraph, which reports on allegations of multiple cover-ups relating to the soaring costs of the scheme. The Sunday Express says that Boris Johnson hopes the UK will become a global trailblazer after leaving the EU. The Sunday Times reports the Prime Minister is on course for a diplomatic war with Donald Trump over plans to hand Huawei access to Britain's 5G network. The Sunday Mirror carries the story of a man who says he was drugged by serial rapist Reynard Sanaga and that a violent struggle ensued between them. The Daily Star says a star of EastEnders is being suspended from the show. And The Sun says model Lauren Goodman has revealed that she's expecting a baby and claims an unnamed England footballer is the father. So Rachel Shabi and Tom Harwood here with me tonight. A number of stories in the papers tomorrow that you want to talk about, but we're going to kick off with the coronavirus, which has obviously led a lot of TV bulletins, but also newspaper front pages. It's featuring on the front of The Observer tomorrow morning as their second story. China puts 50 million in quarantine, and China, the epicentre of this virus, the vast majority of cases still in that country, and China taking some pretty drastic measures to try to contain it.
Incredibly drastic measures. I mean, in this country, imagining quarantining 50 million people is totally unimaginable. This is a epidemic operation on a scale that I'm not sure has been tried before in such a busy and bustling country as China. It's surprising to see entire cities in lockdown and people not being able to move. A deeply worrying thing for 50 million people to be under that pressure, and of course 1,300 cases already confirmed, some as close as France to this country. So this is something that is deeply concerning. It is right that it's taking up quite a lot of the news agenda this weekend.
Well, that's right, and the President of China has spoken about it as well today, hasn't he? And he's talked about the spread of the new virus accelerating. He's talked about the country facing a grave situation. And it's not just the shutting off of towns and cities, stopping the transport, to stop people moving around and potentially spreading it. It's also the building of hospitals in record time as well to try to treat it.
Yeah, that's right, because obviously the hospitals can't cope with the scale of this. It's just mind-boggling scale of an operation that's going on in China right now. And we understand that now 2 new hospitals are going to be built. Last week, there was an announcement that one hospital with capacity to treat 1,000 people was going to be built in 10 days. And now we hear that another one is slated for that as well. But the scale of that operation, to be able to put that volume of people under lockdown, and the level of coordination that requires, and also the level of trust it requires, because you couldn't do that unless there was a buy-in to official pronouncements on what was going on keeping people informed and people believing that they were kept informed of the situation. Otherwise, you might have all kinds of chaos happening with people panicking or worrying. I mean, obviously, it's a hugely worrying situation. It would be incredibly anxiety-inducing to be in that situation, but it does seem to be that it is being processed effectively, at least. But of course, there's only so much you can do with a virus that it is spreading at that scale, and there have been outbreaks outside of China as well now.
Well, that's right, and all of the possible cases that have been tested in this country have proved negative, haven't they? But some suggestions that it has a fair chance of reaching these shores as well. Inside the Mail is a double-page spread focusing on the situation situation for some Britons. They're talking about some of the Britons who are in China, in the affected areas, and certainly Foreign Office advised tonight about avoiding any kind of travel to that area. So the question now is what happens to the ones who are there now?
That's right, and the government seemed to have made a bit of a U-turn just today in terms of initially they were saying we're not going to take anyone out of Wuhan, we're not going to withdraw any British citizens, and now that France and the US seem to be chartering flights to do just that, the government seems to be coming on board now too. And the Mail has spoken to a number of people, a number of Brits who are in that city, who are really desperate and hoping for help from the British government, and it does seem now that the British government will go in and take people out and bring them back to a quarantine situation in this country.
Well, yes, and Public Health England yesterday talked about the risk from the disease as being low, and there are still a lot of questions about it, aren't there? A huge number of cases, as you say, in the thousands, but 41 deaths, and obviously a tragedy, each of those deaths, but there needs to be a lot of questions answered before worries should escalate too much, because obviously seasonal flu is also deadly in some cases as well, and at the moment we don't know whether it'll mutate and become more dangerous, and there are a lot of questions about when it's infectious and how serious it could get at the moment.
That's right. I imagine it's something that's really, really difficult to calibrate, that the tenure of the information that's being given to the public, because you don't want people to be unduly worried, but at the same time, perhaps erring on the side of over-caution isn't a bad thing in this situation either. But you're right that there are questions around when is it actually infectious. It's said to have an incubation period of 7 days, so that's a bit of a worry because you won't be manifesting symptoms in that period when you might be infectious. But at the same time, has been a breakthrough in England in being able to test the virus and have the results within a day, which obviously is incredibly important when you're trying to put people under quarantine who need to be. And there is just round-the-clock race now to develop a vaccine internationally, which presumably is going to come into play quite soon. So yes, it is quite a tough one to calibrate, but in the UK, I don't think there is need to.
And certainly the message is the right preparations are being made in case it does come to this country. So we'll wait and see over the days ahead. Let's move on to another story that's on the front of the Sunday Times that you wanted to talk about. The headline there, Angry Trump casts cloud on Boris's big day. And this seems to focus over whether or not Huawei should get a contract in Britain's 5G network going ahead, and the dispute with America over that.
Right, with the decision being slated for coming out on Tuesday, Culture Secretary Nicky Morgan expected to make that announcement as to whether or not Huawei are going to go ahead with that building project. The pressure from the United States is reaching fever pitch from all different angles. The former presidential candidate, Marco Rubio, has been part of a big effort in trying to say, do not go for this company. Similarly, the president himself and the Treasury Secretary and the State Secretary as well have been all making these big moves, a sort of carrot and stick approach. On the one hand saying, don't do this because look, we can fast track a huge, great free trade agreement between our two countries, and on the other hand saying this is a very dangerous prospect and there could be damaging consequences if you go for it. But the government, I think, feels quite frustrated, as if they're in a bit of a bind, because ultimately they're looking for different people who can build 5G, and there are very few companies around the world that can do it on that scale.
A real tension here.
Definitely. It's a very early test, isn't it, for Boris Johnson? And it sounds like he's leaning into that. I mean, there was a point at which you thought that he was going to blow it off with a review that would kind of delay it for a bit more. But now it seems like a decision is imminent after all. And if he does stand up to Donald Trump on this, which it sounds as though he's going to do, then what does that mean in terms of, does the US then get to make demands in other areas that would affect the trade relationship? But as far as I can tell, I can see no reason why Britain wouldn't make its own assessment about Huawei. There is the fact that the US warnings about it are laced with the US's own dynamic with China. It is part of their trade war with China as much as it is about anything else, and I see no reason why the UK should get dragged into that.
But also it's about those power blocks, and of course the UK is part of the Five Eyes community, that close security relationship between the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia and the UK. And if China is going to become a big player in terms of that sort of technological side of things, then that undermines that Western relationship.
Okay, and let's quickly take in another story that's on the front of the Sunday Telegraph. The Observer also links the story about HS2. The Observer talks about the cost of cancelling it should Boris Johnson make the decision in the next couple of weeks not go ahead with one or both legs of the train line. The Sunday Telegraph has allegations about the costs involved and how they're being presented to us.
That's right. Yeah, the Sunday Telegraph has got the government-owned firm behind HS2. It's been accused of attempting to essentially con Boris Johnson by covering up costs and suggesting that they are lower than they actually are. This is coming from the former director of strategy at HS2, among other people. And of course, the government has denied all of these allegations, but it does sound as though, we already know that it's going to cost much more than was predicted. I think when it all began, it was priced at 30 billion, and now it's well over 100.
And there were some organisations that came out and saying this costing of 30 billion is nowhere near reality. And at the time, HS2 slammed those independent organisations, saying there's no way. I think the Institute of Economic Affairs said it would be 80 billion rather than 30, and now it's clearly going to be 100 billion. So really, it's quite an extraordinary.
And I'm just going to give
ballooning of
HS2 Limited's response to some of the articles around. Their spokesman is saying, following the collapse of Korean, HS2 Limited recognised the need to engage a healthy industry while continuing to protect value for money for the taxpayer, instead of artificially passing risk back and forth as happened on other publicly funded projects. Contractors who do not meet the required performance will lose a proportion of their fee. This incentivises good performance and also prevents windfall profits from public money. And they talk about the executive team and board completely changing since some of the briefings and reports on costs. So that's their word on it. We do have to take a break right now. Plenty more to talk about, though, coming up. We've got lots to talk about. Also, something about Star Trek. That's what's coming up. This story. Stay tuned. And Tom Harwood. And we're turning inside the Sun now, and an article about John Bercow and suggestions that he might be put forward for a peerage, and some resistance in some quarters to that.
Right, this is the extraordinary fallout of that leak from Jeremy Corbyn's nomination list that includes, unprecedentedly, the former Speaker John Bercow. And
unprecedentedly because he's a Tory rather than Labour, is that why?
Well, it's unprecedented because normally the Leader of the Opposition doesn't nominate the Speaker. The Speaker sort of almost automatically gets that sort of nomination, but obviously John Bercow was a very controversial figure in the chair, and now there's a dossier being compiled, including breached NDAs, testimony from former staff, talking about lots of allegations of John Bercow's bullying behaviour as Speaker, and there's been some quite extraordinary quotes come from very senior people and very junior people that are going to be put before the House of Commons Appointments Commission, and that's the body that could veto his peerage. So this dossier is part of an effort to stop him going to the Lords, and this is going to be something that is a very live debate over the next weeks.
And I should say that John Bercow categorically denies any allegations of bullying. He said he's never bullied anyone anywhere at any time.
Right, but those allegations have been made and need to be looked into before such an appointment, you would think.
Okay, and let's try and squeeze in another story about the BBC. This is inside the Mail on Sunday. Today wants professional northerner Robinson to host from Manchester, they're saying.
This just shows the sort of culture inside the BBC. They don't get it. The idea that they're going to be less London-centric by moving to another large metropolitan city. That's not going to help them understand the voters and the people in those left-behind parts of the country. They really need to stop thinking of the North as one conglomerate thing and understand that there are different communities, and this is just sort of a gimmick that I don't think is going to go down well with anyone.
Do you think that's right? Because the suggestion is that they would send one of the presenters for the Today programme up there. That's what they're suggesting here. Do you think that is a gimmick, or do you think it's an important symbol of saying that we're not just London-centric?
I think it's window dressing. You know, the BBC has got a problem, but it's more about the diversity of its staff. I'm not sure that necessarily that switching, putting a studio in the north is going to fix that problem, because, if your staff are still overwhelmingly, from a particular section of society, then of course you're not going to represent the country as a whole.
Okay, and finally, we did promise that we'd talk about Star Trek and Donald Trump.
We did.
Explain why this connection has been made.
Well, Donald Trump has had a sixth branch of the US military created called the Space Force. And of course, a new branch of the military has to have a new logo. This is the logo, and a lot of people, it was unveiled yesterday, and the response was, isn't it similar to the Star Trek logo? And a lot of people were having a lot of fun online yesterday, making a lot of comparisons.
Well, exactly, and I can see there that Donald Trump there looking like he's on the Star Trek Enterprise.
He's been superimposed onto William Shatner's Captain Kirk, which I really wish I hadn't seen. You can't unsee that, can you?
Okay, and on that note, we are out of time, but good to see you both, Rachel and Tom. Thanks very much.
Thank you.